This is the short story The Library Window by Margaret Oliphant, Chapter 1. I was not aware at first of the many discussions which had gone on about that window. It was almost opposite one of the windows of the large old-fashioned drawing room of the house in which I spent that summer, which was of so much importance in my life. Our house and the library were on opposite sides of the broad High Street of St. Rule's, which is a fine street, wide and ample, and very quiet. Strangers think who come from noisier places. But in a summer evening there is much coming and going, and the stillness is full of sound, the sound of footsteps and pleasant voices, softened by the summer air. There are even exceptional moments when it is noisy, the time of the fair, on Saturday nights sometimes, and when there are excursion trains. Then even the softest sunny air of the evening will not smooth the harsh tones and the stumbling steps. But at these unlovely moments we shut the windows, and even I, who am so fond of that deep recess where I can take refuge from all that is going on inside, and make myself a spectator of all the varied story out of doors, withdraw from my watchtower. To tell the truth, there never was very much going on inside. The house belonged to my aunt, to whom, she says, thank God, nothing ever happened. I believe that many things have happened to her in her time, but that was all over at the period of which I'm speaking, and she was old and very quiet. Her life went on in a routine never broken. She got up at the same time every day and did the same things in the same rotation, day by day the same. She said that this was the greatest support in the world, and the routine is a kind of salvation. It may be so, but it is a very dull salvation. And I used to feel that I would rather have incident, whatever kind of incident it might be. But then, at that time, I was not old, which makes all the difference. At the time of which I speak, the deep recess of the drawing-room window was a great comfort to me. Though she was an old lady, perhaps because she was so old, she was very tolerant and had a kind of feeling for me. She never said a word, but often gave me a smile when she saw how I had built myself up with my books and my basket of work. I did very little work, I fear, now and then a few stitches, when the spirit moved me, or when I had got well afloat in a dream and was more tempted to follow it out than to read my book, as sometimes happened. At other times, and if the book were interesting, I used to get through volume after volume, sitting there, paying no attention to anybody. And yet I did pay a kind of attention. Aunt Mary's old ladies came in to call. I heard them talk, though I very seldom listened. But for all that, if they had anything to say that was interesting, it's curious how I found it in my mind afterwards, as if the air had blown it to me. They came and went, and I had the sensation of their old bonnets gliding out and in, and their dresses rustling, and now and then had to jump up and shake hands with someone who knew me and asked after my papa and mamma. Then Aunt Mary would give me a little smile again, and I slipped back to my window. She never seemed to mind. My mother would have not let me do it, I know. She would have remembered dozens of things there were to do. She would have sent me upstairs to fetch something which I was quite sure she did not want, or downstairs to carry some quite unnecessary message to the housemaid. She liked to keep me running about. Perhaps that was one reason why I was so fond of Aunt Mary's drawing room, and the deep recess of the window, and the curtain that fell half over it, and the broad window seat, where one could collect so many things without being found fault with for untidiness. Whenever we had anything the matter with us in these days, we were sent to St. Rule's to get up our strength. This was my case at the time of which I'm going to speak. Everybody had said, since ever I learned to speak, that I was fantastic and fanciful and dreamy, and all the other words with which a girl who may happen to like poetry and to be fond of thinking is so often made uncomfortable. People don't know what they mean when they say fantastic. It sounds like Madge Wildfire or something of that sort. My mother thought I should always be busy to keep nonsense out of my head. But really, I was not at all fond of nonsense. I was rather serious than otherwise. I would have been no trouble to anybody if I'd been left to myself. It was only that I had a sort of second sight and was conscious of things to which I paid no attention. Even when reading the most interesting books, the things that were being talked about blew into me, and I heard what the people were saying in the streets as they passed under the window. Aunt Mary always said I could do 2 or indeed 3 things at once, both read and listen, and see. I'm sure that I did not listen much, and seldom looked out of set purpose, as some people do, who notice what bonnets the ladies in the street have on. But I did hear what I couldn't help hearing, even when I was reading my book, and I did see all sorts of things, though often for a whole half hour I might never lift my eyes. This does not explain what I said at the beginning, that there were many discussions about that window. It was, and still is, the last window in the row of the college library which is opposite my aunt's house in the High Street. Yet it is not exactly opposite, but a little to the west, so that I could see it best from the left side of my recess. I took it calmly for granted that it was a window, like any other, till I first heard the talk about it, which was going on in the drawing room. "Have you ever made up your mind, Mrs. Balcarres," said old Mr. Pitmilly, "whether that window opposite is a window or no?" He said Mistress Balcarres, and he was always called Mr. Pitmilly Morton, which was the name of his place. "I'm never sure of it, to tell the truth," said Aunt Mary, "all these years." "Oh, well, bless me," said one of the old ladies, "and what window may that be?" Mr. Pitmilly had a way of laughing as he spoke, which did not please me, but it was true that he was not perhaps desirous of pleasing me. He said, "Oh, just the window opposite," with his laugh running through his words. "Our friend can never make up her mind about it, though she has been living opposite since—" "You never mind the date," said another. "The library window. Ah, dear me, what should it be but a window? Up at that height it could not be a door." "The question is," said my aunt, "if it is a real window with glass in it, or if it is merely painted, or if it once was a window and has been built up, and the oftener people look at it, the less they are able to say." "Aye, let me see the window," said old Lady Carnby, who was very active and strong-minded. And then they all came crowding upon me, 3 or 4 old ladies, very eager, and Mr. Pitmilly's white hair appearing over their heads, and my aunt sitting quiet and smiling behind. "Oh, I mind the window very well," said Lady Carnby. "Aye, and so do more than me. But its present appearance, it is just like any other window. It has not been cleaned, I should say, in the memory of man." "I see what you mean," said one of the others. "It's just a very dead thing, without any reflection in it. But I've seen as bad before." "Aye, it's dead enough," said another. "But that's no rule. These hisses of women servants in this ill age." "Nay, the women are well enough," said the softest voice of all, which was Aunt Mary's. "I will never let them risk their lives cleaning the outside of mine. And there are no women servants in the old library. There is maybe something more in it than that." They were all pressing into my recess, pressing upon me, a row of old faces, peering into something they could not understand. I had a sense in my mind how curious it was, the wall of old ladies in their old satin gowns, all glazed with age, Lady Carnby with her lace about her head. Nobody was looking at me or thinking of me, but I felt unconsciously the contrast of my youngness to their oldness, and stared at them as they stared over my head at the library window. I had given it no attention up to this time. I was more taken up with the old ladies and with the thing they were looking at. "The framework is right at least, I can see that, and painted black." "Well, and the panes are painted black too. It's no window, Mrs. Balcarres. It's been filled in the days of the window duties. You'll mind, Lady Carnby." "Mind?" said the oldest lady. "I mind when your mother was married, Jeanie. That's neither the day nor yesterday. Oh, but as for the window, it's just a delusion. And that is my opinion of the matter, if you ask me." "Oh, there's a great wane of light in that muckle room of the college," said another. "If it was a window, the library would have more light." "But one thing is sure," said one of the younger ones. "It cannot be a window to see through. It may be filled in, or it may be built up, but it is not a window to give light." "Ah, and who ever heard of a window that was no to see through?" Lady Carnby said. I was fascinated by the look on her face, which was a curious, scornful look, as of one who knew more than she chose to say. And then my wandering fancy was caught by her hand as she held it up, throwing back the lace that dropped over it. Lady Carnby's lace was the chief thing about her. Heavy black Spanish lace with large flowers. Everything she wore was trimmed with it. A large veil of it hung over her old bonnet, but her hand coming out of this heavy lace was a curious thing to see. She had very long fingers, very taper, which had been much admired in her youth. In her hand, and her hand was very white, or rather more than white, pale, bleached, and bloodless, with large blue veins standing up upon the back, and she wore some fine rings, among others a big diamond in an ugly old claw setting. They were too big for her, and were wound round and round with yellow silk to make them keep on. And this little cushion of silk, turned brown with long wearing, had twisted round so that it was more conspicuous than the jewels, while the big diamond blazed underneath in the hollow of her hand, like some dangerous thing hiding and sending out darts of light. The hand, which seemed to come almost to a point, with this strange ornament underneath, clutched at my half-terrified imagination. It too seemed to mean far more than was said. I felt as if it might clutch me with sharp claws, and the lurking, dazzling creature bite, with a sting that would go to the heart. Presently, however, the circle of the old faces broke up. The old ladies returned to their seats, and Mr. Pitmilly, small but very erect, stood up in the midst of them, talking with mild authority like a little oracle among the ladies. Only Lady Carnby always contradicted the neat little old gentleman. She gesticulated when she talked like a Frenchwoman, and darted forth that hand of hers with the lace hanging over it, so that I always caught a glimpse of the lurking diamond. I thought she looked like a witch among the comfortable little group which gave such attention to everything Mr. Pitmilly said. For my part, it is my opinion that there's no window there at all, he said. It's very like the thing that's called in scientific language an optical illusion. It arises generally, if I may use such a word in the presence of ladies, from a liver that is not just in the perfect order and balance that organ demands. And then you will see things. A blue dog, I remember, was the one thing in one case, and in another... The man is gin geet, said Lady Carnby. I mind the windows in the old Libri as long as I mind anything. Is the Libri itself an optical illusion too? No, said the old ladies. A blue dog would be a strange vagary. But the library we've all kent from our youth, said one. And I mind when the assemblies were held there one year, when the town hall was building, another said. It is just a great divert to me, said Aunt Mary. But what was strange was that she paused there and said in a low tone, now, and then went on again. Whoever comes to my house, there are our discussions about that window. I've never just made up my mind about it myself. Sometimes I think it's a case of these wicked window duties, as you said, Miss Jeanie, when half the windows in our houses were blocked up to save the tax. And then I think it may be due to the blank kind of building, like the great new buildings on the earthen mound in Edinburgh, where the windows are just ornaments. And then, whilst I'm sure I can see the glass shining when the sun catches it in the afternoon. Well, you could easily so satisfy yourself, Mrs. Balcrys, if you were to... Give the lady a penny to cast a stone. See what happens, said Lady Carnby. I'm not sure that I have any desire to satisfy myself, Mary said. And then there was a stir in the room, and I had to come out from my recess and open the door for the old ladies and see them downstairs as they all went away, following one another. Mr. Pitmilly gave his arm to Lady Carnby, though she was always contradicting him, and so the tea party dispersed. Aunt Mary came to the head of the stairs with her guest in an old-fashioned, gracious way, while I went down with them to see that the maid was ready at the door. When I came back, Aunt Mary was still standing in the recess looking out. Returning to my seat, she said with a kind of wistful look, Well, honey, what is your opinion? I have no opinion. I was reading my book all the time, I said. And so you were, honey. No, very civil, but all the same, I ken well you heard every word we said. Chapter 2. It was a night in June. Dinner was long over, and had it been winter, the maids would have been shutting up the house, and my Aunt Mary preparing to go upstairs to her room. But it was still clear daylight, that daylight out of which the sun has been long gone, and which has no longer any rose reflections, but all has sunk into a pearly neutral tint, a light which is daylight, yet is not day. We had taken a turn in the garden after dinner, and now we had returned to what we called our usual occupations. My aunt was reading. The English post had come in, and she had got her Times, which was her great diversion. The Scotsman was her morning reading, but she liked her Times at night. As for me, I too was at my usual occupation, which at that time was doing nothing. I had a book, as usual, and was absorbed in it, but I was conscious of all that was going on all the same. The people strolled along the broad pavement, making remarks as they passed under the open window, which came up into my story or my dreams, and sometimes it made me laugh. The tone and the faint sing-song, or rather chant of the accent, which was a wee fifish, was novel to me and associated with holiday and pleasant. And sometimes they said to each other something that was amusing, and often something that suggested a whole story. But presently they began to drop off. The footsteps slackened, the voices died away. It was getting late, though the clear, soft daylight went on and on. All through the lingering evening, which seemed to consist of interminable hours, long but not weary, drawn out as if the spell of light and the outdoor life might never end, I now and then, quite unawares, cast a glance at the mysterious window, which my aunt and her friends had discussed as I felt, though I dared not say it even to myself, rather foolishly. It caught my eye without any intention on my part as I paused, as it were, to take breath, in the flowing and current of undistinguishable thoughts and things from without and within which carried me along. First it occurred to me, with a little sensation of discovery, how absurd to say it was not a window, a living window, one to see through. Why then, they had never seen it, these old folks. I saw, as I looked up, suddenly the faint greyness as of visible space within, a room behind, certainly, dim, as it was a natural room should be on the other side of the street, quite indefinite, yet so clear that if someone were to come to the window, there would be nothing surprising in it. For certainly there was a feeling of space behind the panes which these old half-blind ladies had disputed about, whether they were glass or only fictitious panes marked on the wall. How silly, when eyes that could see could make it out in a minute. It was only a greyness at present, but it was unmistakable, a space that went back into gloom, as every room does when you look at it across a street. There were no curtains to show whether it was inhabited or not, but a room, as distinctly as ever room was. I was pleased with myself, but said nothing, while Aunt Mary rustled her paper, waiting for a favourable moment to announce a discovery which settled her problem at once. Then I was carried away upon the stream again, and forgot the window, till somebody threw unawares a word from the outer world. "I'm going hame, it'll soon be dark." Dark? What was the fool thinking of? It never would be dark if one waited out, wandering in the soft airs for hours longer. And then my eyes, acquiring easily that new habit, looked across the way again. Ah, now, nobody indeed had come to the window, and no light had been lighted, seeing it was still beautiful to read by, a still, clear, colourless light. But the room inside had certainly widened. I could see the grey space and air a little deeper, and a sort of vision, very dim, of a wall, and something against it, something dark, with the blackness that a solid article, however indistinctly seen, takes in the lighter darkness that is only space. A large, black, dark thing coming out into the grey. I looked more intently and made sure it was a piece of furniture, either a writing table or perhaps a large bookcase. No doubt it must be the last, since this was a part of the old library. I never visited the old college library, but I'd seen such places before, and I could well imagine it to myself. How curious that for all the time these old people had looked at it, they'd never seen this before. It was more silent now, and my eyes, I suppose, had grown dim with gazing, doing my best to make it out, when suddenly Aunt Mary said, "You ring the bell, my dear. I must have my lamp." "Your lamp?" I cried, "when it's still daylight?" But then I gave another look at my window, and perceived with a start that the light had indeed changed, for now I saw nothing. It was still light, but there was so much change in the light that my room with the grey space and large shadowy bookcase had gone out, and I saw them no more. For even a Scotch night in June, though it looks as if it would never end, does darken at the last. I had almost cried out, but checked myself, and rang the bell for Aunt Mary, and made up my mind I would say nothing until next morning, and to be sure, naturally, it would be more clear. Next morning, I rather think I forgot all about it, or was busy, or was more idle than usual. The two things meant nearly the same. At all events, I thought no more of the window, though I still sat in my own, opposite to it, but occupied with some other fancy. Aunt Mary's visitors came as usual in the afternoon, but their talk was of other things, and for a day or two, nothing at all happened to bring back my thoughts into this channel. It might be nearly a week before the subject came back, and once more it was old Lady Carnby who set me thinking. Not that she said anything upon that particular theme, but she was the last of my aunt's afternoon guests to go away, and when she rose to leave, she threw up her hands with those lively gesticulations which so many old Scotch ladies have. "My faith," cried she, "is that bairn there still like a dream? Is the creature bewitched, Mary Balcarres? Is she bound to sit there by night and by day for the rest of her days? You should mind that there's things about, uncanny for women of our blood." I was too much startled at first to recognise that it was of me she was speaking. She was like a figure in a picture, with her pale face the colour of ashes, and the big pattern of the Spanish lace hanging half over her, and her hand held up with the big diamond blazing at me from the inside of her uplifted palm. It was held up in surprise, but it looked as if it were raised in malediction, and the diamond threw out darts of light and glared and twinkled at me. If it had been in its right place, it would not have mattered. There, the open of the hand. I started up, half in terror, half in wrath, and then the old lady laughed, and her hand dropped. "Ah, I've wakened you to life and broke the spell," she said, nodding her old head at me. The large black silk flowers of the lace waved and threatened. And she took my arm to go downstairs, laughing and bidding me be steady, and no tremble and shake like a broken reed. "You should be as steady as a rock at your age. Oh, it's like a young tree," she said, leaning so heavily that my willowy girlish frame quivered. "I was a support to virtue, like Pamela in my time." "Aunt Mary, Lady Carnby is a witch," I cried when I came back. "Is that what you think, honey? Well, maybe she once was," said Aunt Mary, whom nothing surprised. And it was that night, once more after dinner, and after the post came in, the Times, that I suddenly saw the library window again. I'd seen it every day and noticed nothing, but tonight, still in a little tumult of mind over Lady Carnby and her wicked diamond which wished me harm, and her lace which waved threats and warnings at me, I looked across the street, and there I saw quite plainly the room opposite, far more clear than before. I saw dimly that it must be a large room, and that the big piece of furniture against the wall was a writing desk. That in a moment, when first my eyes rested upon it, was quite clear. A large, old-fashioned escritoire standing out in the room, and I knew by the shape of it that it had a great many pigeonholes and little drawers in the back, and a large table for writing. There's one just like it in my father's library at home. It was such a surprise to see it all so clearly that I closed my eyes, for the moment almost giddy, wondering how Papa's desk could have come here. And then when I reminded myself that this was nonsense, and that there were many such writing tables beside Papa's, and looked again, lo, it had all become quite vague and indistinct, as it was at first, and I saw nothing but the blank window of which the old ladies could never be certain whether it was filled up to avoid the window tax, or whether it had ever been a window at all. This occupied my mind very much, and yet I did not say anything to Aunt Mary. For one thing, I rarely saw anything at all in the early part of the day, but then that is natural. You can never see into a place from outside, whether it is an empty room or a looking-glass or people's eyes, or anything else that is mysterious. In the day, it has, I suppose, something to do with the light. But in the evening in June in Scotland, then is the time to see it. For it is daylight, yet it is not day, and there is a quality in it which I cannot describe. It's so clear, as if every object was a reflection of itself. I used to see more and more of the room as the days went on. The large escritoire stood out more and more into the space, with sometimes white glimmering things which looked like papers lying on it. Once or twice I was sure I saw a pile of books on the floor close to the writing table, as if they had gilding upon them in broken specks like old books. It was always about the time when the lads in the street began to call to each other that they were coming home, and sometimes a shriller voice would come from one of the doors bidding somebody to cry upon the laddies to come back to their suppers. That was always the time I saw best, but it was close upon the moment when the veil seemed to fall, and the clear radiance became less living, and all the sounds died out of the streets, and Aunt Mary said in her soft voice, "Honey, will you ring for the lamp?" She said honey as people say darling, and I think it is a prettier word. Then finally, while I sat one evening with my book in my hand, looking straight across the street, not distracted by anything, I saw a little movement within. There was not anyone visible, but everybody must know what it is to see the stir in the air, the little disturbance. You cannot tell what it is, but that it indicates someone there, even though you can see no one. Perhaps it is a shadow making just one flicker in the still place. You may look at an empty room and the furniture in it for hours, and then suddenly there will be the flicker, and you know that someone has come into it. It might only be a dog or a cat. It might be, if that were possible, a bird flying across, but it is someone, something living, which is so different, so completely different, in a moment from the things that are not living. It seemed to strike quite through me, and I gave a little cry. Then Aunt Mary stirred a little and put down the huge newspaper that almost covered her from sight and said, "Oh, what is it, honey?" I cried. "Nothing," with a little gasp, quickly, for I did not want to be disturbed just at this moment when somebody was coming. But I suppose she was not satisfied, for she got up and stood behind me to see what it was, putting her hand on my shoulder. It was the softest touch in the world, but I could have flung it off angrily. For that moment everything was still again, and the place grew grey, and I saw no more. "Nothing," I repeated, but I was so vexed I could have cried. "I told you it was nothing, Aunt Mary. Don't you believe me? Then you come to look and spoil it all." I did not mean, of course, to say these last words. They were forced out of me. I was so much annoyed to see it all melt away like a dream, for it was no dream, but as real as myself or anything I ever saw. She gave my shoulder a little pat with her hand. "Honey," she said, "are you looking at something? Is it what?" I wanted to say, shaking off her hand. But something in me stopped me, for I said nothing at all, and she went quietly back to her place. I suppose she must have rung the bell herself, for immediately I felt the soft flood of the light behind me, and the evening outside dimmed down as it did every night, and I saw nothing more. It was next day, I think, in the afternoon that I spoke. It was brought on by something she said about her fine work. "I get a mist before my eyes," she said. "You'll have to learn my old lace stitches, honey, for I soon will not be able to see the threads." "I hope you will keep your sight," I cried without thinking what I was saying. I was then young and very matter of fact. I had not found out that one may mean something, yet not half or 100 part of what one seems to mean, and even then probably hoping to be contradicted, if it is anyhow against oneself. My sight," she said, looking up at me with a look that was almost angry. "There's no question of me losing my sight. On the contrary, my eyes are very strong. I may not see to draw fine threads, but I see at a distance as well as I ever did, as well as you do." "Oh, I did not mean any harm, Aunt Mary," I said. "I thought you said, but how can your sight be as good as ever when you're in doubt about that window? I can see into the room as clear as—" My voice wavered, for I had just looked up and across the street, and I could have sworn that there was no window at all, but only a false image of one painted on the wall. "Ah," she said, with a little tone of keenness and of surprise, and she half rose up, throwing down her work hastily, as if she meant to come to me. Then, perhaps, seeing the bewildered look on my face, she paused and hesitated. "Hi, honey," she said. "Have you got so far as Ben as that?" What did she mean? Of course, I knew all the old Scots phrases as well as I knew myself, but it's a comfort to take refuge in a little ignorance, and I know I pretended not to understand whenever I was put out. "I don't know what you mean by far Ben," I cried out, very impatient. I don't know what might have followed, but someone just then came to call, and she could only give me a look before she went forward, putting out her hand to her visitor. It was a very soft look, but anxious, as if she did not know what to do, and she shook her head a very little, and I thought that there was a smile on her face, there was something wet about her eyes. I retired into my recess, and nothing more was said. But it was very tantalizing that it should fluctuate so, for sometimes I saw that room quite plain and clear, quite as clear as I could see my papa's library, for example, when I shut my eyes. I compared it naturally to my father's study, because of the shape of the writing table, which, as I tell you, was the same as his. At times I saw the papers on the table quite plain, just as I had seen his papers many a day, and the little pile of books on the floor, not ranged regularly in order, but put down one above the other, with all the angles going different ways, and a speck of the old gilding shining here and there. And then again at other times I saw nothing, absolutely nothing, and was no better than the old ladies who had peered over my head, drawing their eyelids together and arguing that the window had been shut up because of the old, long-abolished window tax, or else that it had never been a window at all. It annoyed me very much at those dull moments to feel that I too puckered up my eyelids and saw no better than they. Aunt Mary's old ladies came and went day after day while June went on. I was to go back in July, and I felt that I should be very unwilling indeed to leave until I had quite cleared up, as I was indeed in the way of doing, the mystery of that window, which changed so strangely and appeared quite a different thing, not only to different people, but to the same eyes at different times. Of course, I said to myself it must simply be an effect of the light, and yet I did not quite like that explanation either, but would have been better pleased to make out to myself that it was some superiority in me which made it so clear to me, for only the great superiority of young eyes over old. That was not quite enough to satisfy me, seeing it was a superiority which I shared with every little lass and lad in the street. I rather wanted, I believe, to think that there was some particular insight in me which gave clearness to my sight, which was a most impertinent assumption, but really did not mean half the harm it seems to mean when it is put down here in black and white. I had several times again, however, seen the room quite plain, and made out that it was a large room, with a great picture in a dim gilded frame hanging on the far wall, and many other pieces of solid furniture, making a blackness here and there, besides the great escritoire against the wall, which had evidently been placed near the window for the sake of the light. One thing became visible to me after another, till I almost thought I should end up by being able to read the old lettering on one of the big volumes which projected from the others and caught the light. But this was all preliminary to the great event which happened about Midsummer Day, the day of St. John, which was once so much thought of as a festival, but now means nothing at all in Scotland, any more than any of the other saints' days, which I shall always think a great pity and loss to Scotland, whatever Aunt Mary may say. Chapter 3. It was about midsummer. I cannot say exactly to a day when, but near that time, when the great event happened. I had grown very well acquainted by that time with the large, dim room, not only with the escritoire, which was very plain to me now, with the papers upon it and the books at its foot, but the great picture that hung across the farther wall, and various other shadowy pieces of furniture, especially a chair, which, one evening, I saw had been moved into the space before the escritoire, a little change which made my heart beat, for it spoke so distinctly of someone who must have been there, the someone who had already made me start 2 or 3 times before by some vague shadow of him or thrill of him, which made a sort of movement in the silent space, a movement which made me sure that the next minute I must see something or hear something which would explain the whole, if it were not that something always happened outside to stop it at the very moment of its accomplishment. I had no warning this time of movement or shadow. I had been looking into the room very attentively a little while before. I had made out everything almost clearer than ever, and then had bent my attention again on my book and read a chapter or two, the most exciting period of the story, and consequently had quite left St. Rawls in the High Street and the college library, and was really in a South American forest, almost throttled by the flowery creepers, and treading softly, lest I should put my foot on a scorpion or a dangerous snake. At this moment, something suddenly calling my attention to the outside, I looked across, and then, with a start, sprang up, for I could not but contain myself. I don't know what I said, but enough to startle the people in the room, one of whom was old Mr. Pitmilly. They all looked round upon me to ask what was the matter, and when I gave my usual answer of nothing, sitting down again, shamefaced, but very much excited, Mr. Pitmilly got up and came forward, and looked out, apparently to see what was the cause. He saw nothing, for when he went back again, I could hear him telling Aunt Mary not to be alarmed, for Missy had fallen into a doze with the heat and had startled herself waking up, at which they all laughed. Another time I could have killed him for his impertinence, but my mind was too much taken up now to pay any attention. My head was throbbing and my heart beating. I was in such high excitement, however, that to restrain myself completely, to be perfectly silent, was more easy to me then than at any other time in my life. I waited until the old gentleman had taken his seat again, and then I looked back. Yes, there he was. I had not been deceived. I knew then, when I looked across, that this was what I had been looking for all the time, that I had known he was there and had been waiting for him. Every time there was that flicker of movement in the room, him and no one else. And there at last, just as I had expected, he was. I don't know that in reality I ever had expected him or anyone, but this is what I felt when, suddenly looking into that curious dim room, I saw him there. He was sitting in the chair, which he must have placed for himself, or which someone else in the dead of night, when nobody was looking, must have set for him in front of the escritoire, with the back of his head towards me, writing. The light fell upon him from the left hand, and therefore upon his shoulders and the side of his head, which, however, was too much turned away to show anything of his face. How strange that there should be someone staring at him as I was doing, and he never to turn his head to make a movement. If anyone stood and looked at me, were I in the soundest sleep that ever was, I would wake, I would jump up, I would feel it through everything. But there he sat, and never moved. You're not to suppose, though I said the light fell upon him from the left hand, that there was very much light. There never is in a room you're looking into like that across the street. But there was enough to see him by, the outline of his figure, dark and solid, seated in the chair, and the fairness of his head, visible faintly, a clear spot against the dimness. I saw this outline against the dim gilding of the frame of the large picture which hung on the farther wall. I sat. All the time the visitors were there in a sort of rapture, gazing at this figure. I knew no reason why I should be so much moved. In an ordinary way, to see a student at an opposite window quietly doing his work might have interested me a little, but certainly it would not have moved me in any such way. It's always interesting to have a glimpse like this of an unknown life, to see so much and yet know so little, and to wonder, perhaps, what the man is doing, and why he never turns his head. One would go to the window, but not too close, lest he should see you and think you are spying upon him. And one would ask, is he still there? Is he writing? Writing always? I wonder what he's writing. And it would be a great amusement, but no more. This was not my feeling at all in the present case. It was a sort of breathless watch, an absorption. I did not feel that I had eyes for anything else, or any room in my mind for another thought. I no longer heard, as I generally did, the stories and the wise remarks, or foolish, of Aunt Mary's old ladies or Mr. Pitmilly. I heard only a murmur behind me, the interchange of voices, one softer, one sharper. But it was not as in the time when I sat reading and heard every word till the story in my book and the stories they were telling, what they said almost always shaped into stories, were all mingled into each other, and the hero in the novel became somehow the hero, or more likely heroine, of them all. But I took no notice of what they were saying now, and it was not that there was anything very interesting to look at, except the fact that he was there. He did nothing to keep up the absorption of my thoughts. He moved just so much as a man will do when he is very busily writing, thinking of nothing else. There was a faint turn of his head as he went from one side to another of the page he was writing, but it appeared to be a long page which never wanted turning. Just a little inclination when he was at the end of the line, outward, and then a little inclination inward when he began at the next. That was little enough to keep one gazing, but I suppose it was the gradual course of events leading up to this, the finding out of one thing after another as the eyes got accustomed to the vague light. First the room itself, and then the writing table, then the other furniture, and last of all the human inhabitant who gave it all meaning. This was all so interesting that it was like a country which one had discovered. And then the extraordinary blindness of the other people, who disputed amongst themselves whether it was a window at all. I did not, I'm sure, wish to be disrespectful, and I was very fond of my Aunt Mary, and I liked Mr. Pitmilly well enough, and I was afraid of Lady Carnby, but yet to think of I know I ought not to say stupidity, but the blindness of them, the foolishness, the insensibility, discussing it as if the thing that your eyes could see was a thing to discuss. It would have been unkind to think it was because they were old and their faculties dimmed. It is so sad to think that the faculties grow dim, that such a woman as my Aunt Mary should fail in seeing, or hearing, or feeling, that I would not have dwelt on it for a moment. It would have seemed so cruel. And then such a clever old lady as Lady Carnby, who could see through a millstone, people said, Mr. Pitmilly, such an old man of the world. It did indeed bring tears to my eyes to think that all those clever people, solely by reason of being no longer young as I was, should have the simplest things shut out from them, and for all their wisdom and their knowledge be unable to see what a girl like me could see so easily. I was too much grieved for them to dwell upon that thought, and half ashamed, though perhaps half proud too, to be so much better off than they. All those thoughts flitted through my mind as I sat and gazed across the street. I felt there was so much going on in that room across the street. He was so absorbed in his writing, never looked up, never paused for a word, never turned round in his chair or got up and walked about the room as my father did. Papa is a great writer, everybody says. But he would have come to the window and looked out. He would have drummed with his fingers on the pane. He would have watched a fly and helped it over a difficulty, played with the fringe of the curtain, done a dozen other nice, pleasant, foolish things till the next sentence took shape. "My dear, I am waiting for a word," he would say to my mother when she looked at him with a question why he was so idle in her eyes, and then he would laugh and go back again to his writing table. But he, over there, never stopped at all. It was like a fascination. I could not take my eyes from him and that little, scarcely perceptible movement he made, turning his head. I trembled with impatience to see him turn the page, or perhaps throw down his finished sheet on the floor as somebody looking into a window like me once saw Sir Walter do, sheet after sheet. I should have cried out if this unknown had done that. I should not have been able to help myself, whoever had been present. And gradually I got into such a state of suspense, waiting for it to be done, that my head grew hot and my hands cold. And then, just when there was a little movement of his elbow, as if he were about to do this, to be called away by Aunt Mary to see Lady Carnby to the door. I believe I did not hear her till she had called me 3 times, and then I stumbled up, all flushed and hot and nearly crying. When I came out from the recess to give the old lady my arm, Mr. Pitmilly had gone away some time before. She put up her hand and stroked my cheek. "What ails the bairn?" she said. "She's fevered. You must not let her sit in the lane in the window, Mary Balcarres. You and me know what comes of that." Her old fingers had a strange touch, cold like something not living, and I felt that dreadful diamond sting me on the cheek. I do not say that this was not just a part of my excitement and suspense, and I know it is enough to make anyone laugh when the excitement was all about an unknown man writing in a room on the other side of the way, and my impatience because he never came to an end of the page. If you think I was not quite as well aware of this as anyone could be, but the worst was that this dreadful old lady felt my heart beating against her arm that was within mine. "You're just in a dream," she said to me, with her old voice close at my ear as we went downstairs. "I don't know who it is about, but it's bound to be some man that is not worth it. If you were wise, you would think no more of him." "I'm thinking of no man," I said, half crying. "It's very unkind and dreadful of you to say so, Lady Carnby. I never thought of any man in all my life," I cried in a passion of indignation. The old lady clung tighter to my arm and pressed it to her, not unkindly. "Poor little bird," she said. "How it's struggling and fluttering. I'm not saying but what it's more dangerous when it's all for a dream." She was not at all unkind, but I was very angry and excited and would scarcely shake that old pale hand which she put out to me from her carriage window when I had helped her in. I was angry with her, and I was afraid of the diamond, which looked up from under her finger as if it saw through and through me. And whether you believe me or not, I'm certain that it stung me. A sharp, malignant prick, full of meaning. She never wore gloves, but only black lace mittens, through which that horrible diamond gleamed. I ran upstairs. She had been the last to go, and Aunt Mary, too, had gone to get ready for dinner, for it was late. I hurried to my place and looked across with my heart beating more than ever. I made quite sure I should see the finished sheet lying white upon the floor, but what I gazed at was only the dim blank of that window, which they said was no window at all. The light had changed in some wonderful way during that 5 minutes had been gone. There was nothing, not a reflection, not a glimmer. It looked exactly as they all said, the blank form of a window painted on the wall. It was too much. I sat down in my excitement and cried as if my heart would break. I felt that they had done something to it, that it was not natural, that I could not bear their unkindness, even Aunt Mary. They thought it was not good for me, not good for me. They had done something. Even Aunt Mary herself, that wicked diamond that hid itself in Lady Carnby's hand. Of course, I knew all this was ridiculous, as well as you could tell me, but I was exasperated by the disappointment and the sudden stop to all my excited feelings, and I could not bear it. It was more strong than I. I was late for dinner, and naturally there were some traces in my eyes that I had been crying when I came into the full light in the dining room, where Aunt Mary could look at me at her pleasure, and I could not run away. She said, "Honey, you have been shedding tears. I'm loath that a bairn of your mother's should be made to shed tears in my house." "I've not been made to shed tears," cried I. And then, to save myself another fit of crying, I burst out laughing and said, "I'm afraid of that dreadful diamond on old Lady Carnby's hand. It bites, I'm sure it bites. Aunt Mary, look here. Oh, you foolish lassie, Aunt Mary said, but she looked at my cheek under the light of the lamp, and then she gave it a little pat with her soft hand. Go away with you, you silly bairn. There's no bite, but a flushed cheek, my honey, and a wet eye. You must just read out my paper to me after dinner when the post is in, and we'll have no more thinking and no more dreaming for tonight. Yes, Aunt Mary, said I, but I knew what would happen, for when she opens up her Times, all full of the news of the world and the speeches and things which she takes an interest in, but cannot tell why, she forgets. And as I kept very quiet and made not a sound, she forgot tonight what she had said, and the curtain hung a little more over me than usual. I sat down in my recess as if it had been 100 miles away. My heart gave a great jump, as if it would have come out of my breast, for he was there, but not as he had been in the morning. I suppose the light perhaps was not good enough to go on with his work without a lamp or candles, for he had turned away from the table and was fronting the window, sitting leaning back in his chair and turning his head to me. Not to me, for he knew nothing about me. I thought he was not looking at anything, but with his face turned my way. My heart was in my mouth. It was so unexpected, so strange, though why it should have seemed strange I know not, for there was no communication between him and me that it should have moved me. And what could be more natural than a man, wearied of his work and feeling the want perhaps of more light, and yet that it was not dark enough to light a lamp, should turn round in his own chair and rest a little and think, well, perhaps of nothing at all. Papa always says that he's thinking of nothing at all. He says things blow through his mind as if the doors were open, and he has no responsibility. What sort of things were blowing through this man's mind? Was he thinking, still thinking of what he had been writing and going on with it still? The thing that troubled me most was that I could not make out his face. It's very difficult to do so when you see a person only through two windows, your own and his. I wanted very much to recognise him afterwards if I should chance to meet him in the street. If he had only stood up and moved about the room, I should have made out the rest of his figure, and then I should have known him again. Or if he had only come to the window, as Pa always did, then I should have seen his face clearly enough to have recognised him. But, to be sure, he did not see any need to do anything in order that I might recognise him, for he did not know I existed. And probably, if he had known I was watching him, he would have been annoyed and gone away. But he was as immovable there, facing the window, as he had been seated at the desk. Sometimes he made a little faint stir with a hand or a foot, and I held my breath, hoping he was about to rise from his chair. But he never did it. And with all the efforts I made, I could not be sure of his face. I puckered my eyelids together as old Miss Jeanie did, who was short-sighted, and I put my hands on each side of my face to concentrate the light on him. But it was all in vain. Either the face changed as I sat staring, or else it was the light that was not good enough, or I don't know what it was. His hair seemed to me light. Certainly there was no dark line about his head, as there would have been had it been very dark. And I saw, when it came across the old gilt frame on the wall behind, that it must be fair. And I'm almost sure that he had no beard. Indeed, I'm sure that he had no beard. The outline of his face was distinct enough, and the daylight was still quite clear out of doors, so that I recognised perfectly a baker's boy who was on the pavement opposite, and whom I should have known again whenever I had met him. As if it was the least importance to recognise a baker's boy. There's one thing, however, rather curious about this boy. He had been throwing stones at something or somebody. In St. Rules they have a great way of throwing stones at each other, and I suppose there'd been a battle. I suppose also that he had one stone in his hand left over from the battle, and his roving eye took in all the incidents of the street to judge where he could throw it with most effect and mischief. But apparently he found nothing worthy of it in the street, for he suddenly turned round, with a flick under his leg to show his cleverness, and aimed it straight at the window. I remarked, without remarking, that it struck with a hard sound and without any breaking of glass, and fell straight down on the pavement. But I took no notice of this even in my mind, so intently was I watching the figure within, which moved not, nor took the slightest notice, and remained just as dimly clear, as perfectly seen, yet as indistinguishable as before. And then the light began to fail a little, not diminishing the prospect within, but making it still less distinct than it had been. Then I jumped up, feeling Aunt Mary's hand upon my shoulder. "Honey," she said, "I asked you twice to ring the bell, but you did not hear me." "Oh, Aunt Mary," I cried in great penitence, but turning again to the window in spite of myself. "You must come away from there. You You must come away from there, she said, almost as if she were angry, and then her soft voice grew softer, and she gave me a kiss. Never mind about the lamp, honey. I've rung myself, and it is coming, but, silly bairn, you must not be dreaming. Your little head will turn. All the answer I made, for I could scarcely speak, was to give a little wave with my hand to the window on the other side of the street. She stood there, patting me softly on the shoulder for a whole minute or more, murmuring something that sounded like, she must go away, she must go away. Then she said, always with her hand soft upon my shoulder, like a dream when one awaketh. And when I looked again, I saw the blank of an opaque surface and nothing more. Aunt Mary asked me no more questions. She made me come into the room and sit in the light and read something to her. But I did not know what I was reading, for there suddenly came into my mind and took possession of it the thud of the stone upon the window, and its descent straight down, as if from some hard substance that threw it off, though I myself had seen it strike upon the glass of the panes across the way. Chapter 4. I'm afraid I continued in a state of great exultation and commotion of mind for some time. I used to hurry through the day till the evening came, when I could watch my neighbour through the window opposite. I did not talk much to anyone. I never said a word about my own questions and wonderings. I wondered who he was, what he was doing, and why he never came till the evening, or very rarely. And I also wondered much to what house the room belonged in which he sat. It seemed to form a portion of the old college library, as I have often said. The window was one of the line of windows which I understood lighted the large hall, but whether this room belonged to the library itself, or how its occupant gained access to it, I could not tell. I made up my mind that it must open out of the hall, and that the gentleman must be the librarian or one of his assistants, perhaps kept busy all the day in his official duties, and only able to get to his desk and do his own private work in the evening. One has heard of so many things like that, a man who had to take up some other kind of work for his living, and then, when his leisure time came, gave it all up to something he really loved, some study or some book he was writing. My father himself at one time had been like that. He had been in the treasury all day, and then in the evening wrote his books, which made him famous. His daughter, however little she might know of other things, could not but know that. But it discouraged me very much when somebody pointed out to me one day in the street an old gentleman who wore a wig and took a great deal of snuff and said, "That's the librarian of the old college." It gave me a great shock for a moment. But then I remembered that an old gentleman has generally assistants, and that it must be one of them. Gradually I became quite sure of this. There was another small window above which twinkled very much when the sun shone, and looked a very kindly bright little window, above the dullness of the other one which hid so much. I made up my mind that this was the window of his other room, and that these two chambers at the end of the beautiful hall were really beautiful for him to live in, so near all the books, and so retired and quiet that nobody knew of them. What a fine thing for him! And you could see what use he made of his good fortune as he sat there, so constant at his writing for hours together. Was it a book he was writing, or could it be perhaps poems? This was the thought which made my heart beat, but I concluded with much regret that it could not be poems, because no one could possibly write poems like that straight off, without pausing for a word or a rhyme. Had they been poems, he must have risen up, he must have paced about the room, or come to the window as Papa did. Not that Papa wrote poems. He always said, "I am not worthy even to speak of such prevailing mysteries," shaking his head, which gave me a wonderful admiration and almost awe of a poet who was thus much greater even than Papa. But I could not believe that a poet could have kept still for hours and hours like that. What could it be then? Perhaps it was history. That is a great thing to work at, but you would not perhaps need to move, nor to stride up and down, or look out upon the sky and the wonderful light. He did move, now and then, however, though he never came to the window. Sometimes, as I have said, he would turn round in his chair and turn his face toward it, and sit there for a long time musing when the light had begun to fail, and the world was full of that strange day which was night, that light without colour, which everything was so clearly visible, and there were no shadows. It was between the night and day when the fairy folk had power. This was the afterlight of the wonderful, long summer evening, the light without shadows. It had a spell in it. Sometimes it made me afraid. And all manner of strange thoughts seemed to come in, and I always felt If only we had a little more vision in our eyes, we might see beautiful folk walking about in it who were not of our world. I thought most likely he saw them from the way he sat there looking out. This made my heart expand with the most curious sensation, as if of pride that though I could not see, he did, and did not even require to come to the window as I did, sitting close in the depths of the recess with my eyes upon him, and almost seeing things through his eyes. I was so much absorbed in these thoughts and in watching him every evening, for now he never missed an evening but was always there, that people began to remark that I was looking pale and that I could not be well, for I paid no attention when they talked to me, and did not care to go out, nor to join the other girls for their tennis, nor to do anything that others did. And some said to Aunt Mary that I was quickly losing all the ground I had gained, and that she could never send me back to my mother with a white face like that. Aunt Mary had begun to look at me anxiously for some time before that, and I am sure held secret consultations over me, sometimes with the doctor, and sometimes with her old ladies, who thought they knew more about young girls than even the doctors. And I could hear them saying to her that I wanted diversion, that I must be diverted, that she must take me out more, give a party, and when the summer visitors began to come, there would perhaps be a ball or two, or Lady Carnby could get up a picnic. Hey, and there's my young lord coming home, said the old lady, whom they called Miss Jeanie, and I never knew the young lassie yet that could not cock up her bonnet at the sight of a young lord. But Aunt Mary shook her head. I would not lippen so much to the young lord, she said. His mother is sore set upon siller for him. My poor bit honey has no fortune to speak of. Now we must not fly so high as the young lord, but I will gladly take her about the country to see the old castles and towers. I will perhaps rouse her up a bit. Hey, and if that does not answer, we must think of something else, the old lady said. I heard them perhaps that day because they were talking of me, which is always so effective a way of making you hear. For latterly I had not been paying any attention to what they were saying, and I thought to myself how little they knew, and how little I cared about even the old castles and curious houses, having something else in my mind. But just about that time Mr. Pitmilly came in, who was always a friend to me, and when he heard them talking he managed to stop them, and turn the conversation into another channel. And after a while, when the ladies were gone away, he came up to my recess and gave a glance right over my head. And then he asked my Aunt Mary if ever she had settled her question about the window opposite, that you thought was a window sometimes, and then not a window, and many curious things, the old gentleman said. My Aunt Mary gave me another very wistful look, and then she said, Indeed, Mr. Pitmilly, we are just where we were, and I'm quite as unsettled as ever, and I think my niece, she has taken up my views, for I see her many a time looking across and wondering, and I'm not clear now what her opinion is. My opinion, I said. Aunt Mary. I could not help being a little scornful, as one is when one is very young. I have no opinion. It was not only a window, but there was a room, and I could show you, I was going to say, show you the gentleman who sits and writes in it. But I stopped, not knowing what they might say, and looked from one to another. I could tell you all the furniture there is in it, I said. I felt something like a flame that went over my face, and that all at once my cheeks were burning. I thought they gave a little glance at each other, but that may have been folly. There's a great picture in a big dim frame, I said, feeling a little breathless, on the wall opposite the window. Is there so? Mr. Pitmilly with a little laugh, and he said, Now I will tell you what we'll do. You know that there is a conversation party, or whatever they call it, in the big rooms tonight, and it'll be all open and lighted up. It's a handsome room, and 2-3 things worth well looking at. I will just step along after we've all got our dinner and take you over to the party, Missy and you. Oh, dear me, said Aunt Mary. I have not gone to a party for more years than I would like to say. Never once to the library hall. Then she gave a little shiver and said quite low, I could not go there. You will just begin again tonight, madam, said Mr. Pitmilly, taking no notice of this. And a proud man will I be leading a Mistress Balcarres that was once the pride of the ball. Once, said Aunt Mary, with a low little laugh, and then a sigh. I will not say how long ago. After that she made a pause, looking always at me, and then she said, I accept your offer, and put on our broads, and I hope you'll have no occasion to think shame of us, but why not take your dinner here? That was how it was settled. and the old gentleman went away to dress, looking quite pleased. But I came to Aunt Mary as soon as he was gone, and besought her not to make me go. I like the long bonny night and the light that lasts so long, and I cannot bear to dress up and go out, wasting it all in a stupid party. I hate parties, Aunt Mary, I cried. I'd far rather stay here. My honey, she said, taking both my hands, I know it will be a blow to you, but it's better so. How could it be a blow to me? I cried, but I would far rather not go. You'll just go with me, honey, just this once. It is not often I go out. You'll go with me this one night, just this one night, my honey sweet. I'm sure there were tears in Aunt Mary's eyes, and she kissed me between the words. There was nothing more that I could say, but how I grudged the evening, a mere party, conversazione, when all the college was away too, and nobody to make conversation. Instead of my enchanted hour at my window, and the soft, strange light, and the dim face looking out, which kept me wondering and wondering what he was thinking of, what he was looking for. Who was he? All one wonder and mystery and question through the long, long, slow fading night. It occurred to me, however, when I was dressing, I was so sure that he would prefer his solitude to everything, that he might perhaps, it was just possible, be there. And when I thought of that, I took out my white frock, though Janet had laid out my blue one, and my little pearl necklace, which I had thought was too good to wear. They were not very large pearls, but they were real pearls, and very even and lustrous, though they were small. Though I did not think much of my appearance then, there must have been something about me, pale as I was, but apt to colour in a moment, with my dress so white, and my pearls so white, and my hair all shadowy, perhaps that was pleasant to look at. For even old Mr. Pitmanley had a strange look in his eyes, as if he was not only pleased, but sorry too, perhaps thinking me a creature that would have troubles in this life, though I was so young and knew them not. And when Aunt Mary looked at me, there was a little quiver about her mouth. She herself had on her pretty lace, and her white hair very nicely done, looking her best. As for Mr. Pitmanley, he had a beautiful, fine French cambric frill to his shirt, plaited in the most minute plaits, and with a diamond pin in it which was sparkling as much as Lady Cambri's ring. But this was a fine, frank, kindly stone that looked you straight in the face and sparkled, with the light dancing in it as if it were pleased to see you, and to be shining on that old gentleman's honest and faithful breast. For he had been one of Aunt Mary's lovers in their early days, and still thought there was nobody like her in the whole world. I had got into quite a happy commotion of mind by the time we set out across the street in the soft light of the evening to the library hall. Perhaps, after all, I should see him, and see the room which I was so well acquainted with, and find out why he sat there so constantly and never was seen abroad. I thought I might even hear what he was working at, which would be such a pleasant thing to tell Papa when I went home. A friend of mine at St. Rule's, far, far more busy than you ever were, Papa. And then my father would laugh, as he always did, and say he was but an idler and never busy at all. The room was all light and bright, flowers wherever flowers could be, a long line of the books that went along the walls on each side, lighting up wherever there was a line of gilding or an ornament with a little response. It dazzled me at first, all that light, but I was very eager, though I kept very quiet, looking round to see if perhaps in any corner, in the middle of any group, he would be there. I did not expect to see him among the ladies. He would not be with them. He was too studious, too silent. Perhaps among that circle of grey heads at the upper end of the room, perhaps. No. I'm not sure that it was not half a pleasure to me to make quite sure that there was not one whom I could take for him, who was at all like my vague image of him. No, it was absurd to think that he would be here, amid all that sound of voices under the glare of that light. I felt a little proud to think that he was in his room as usual, doing his work or thinking so deeply over it, as when he turned round in his chair with his face to the light. I was thus getting a little composed and quiet in my mind, and now that the expectation of seeing him was over, though it was a bit of a disappointment, it was a satisfaction too, when Mr. Pitmanley came up to me, holding out his arm. "Now," said he, "I am going to take you to see the curiosities." I thought to myself that after I had seen them and spoken to everybody I knew, Aunt Mary would let me go home, so I went very willingly, though I did not care for the curiosities. Something, however, struck me strangely as we walked up the room. It was the air, rather fresh and strong from an open window at the east end of the hall. How should there be a window there? I hardly saw what it meant for the first moment, but it blew in my face as if there was some meaning in it, and I felt very uneasy without seeing why. And there was another thing that startled me. On that side of the wall which was to the street there seemed no windows at all. A long line of bookcases filled it from end to end. I could not see what that meant either, but it confused me. I was altogether confused. I felt as if I was in a strange country, not knowing where I was going, not knowing what I might find out next. If there were no windows on the wall to the street, where was my window? My heart, which had been leaping up and calming down again all this time, gave a great leap at this, as if it would have come out of me, but I did not know what it could mean. And then we stopped before a glass case. Mr. Pitnelly showed me some things in it. I could not pay much attention to them. My head was going round and round. I heard his voice going on, and then myself speaking, a queer sound that was hollow in my ears, but I did not know what I was saying or what he was saying. Then he took me to the very end of the room, the east end, saying something that I caught. But I was pale, for the air would do me good. The air was blowing full on me, lifting the lace of my dress, lifting my hair, almost chilly. The window opened into the pale daylight, into the little lane that ran by the end of the building. Mr. Pitnelly went on talking, but I could not make out a word he said. Then I heard my own voice, speaking through it, though I did not seem to be aware that I was speaking. Where is my window? Where then is my window? I seemed to be saying, and I turned right round, dragging him with me, still holding his arm. As I did this, my eye fell upon something at last which I knew. It was a large picture in a broad frame hanging against the farther wall. What did it mean? What did it mean? I turned again to the open window at the east end, and to the daylight, the strange light without any shadow that was all around about this lighted hall, holding it like a bubble that would burst, like something that was not real. The real place was the room I knew, in which that picture was hanging. The writing table was, and where he sat with his face to the light. But where was the light, and the window through which it came? I think my senses must have left me. I went up to the picture which I knew, and then I walked straight across the room, almost dragging Mr. Pitnelly, whose face was pale, but who did not struggle, but allowed me to lead him straight across to where the window was. Where the window was not, where there was no sign of it. Where is my window? Where is my window? I said. And all the time I was sure that I was in a dream, and these lights were all some theatrical illusion, and the people talking, and nothing real but the pale, pale, watching, lingering day, standing by to wait until that foolish bubble should burst. My dear, said Mr. Pitnelly, my dear, mind that you're in public. Mind where you are. You must not make an outcry and frighten your Aunt Mary. Come away with me. Come away, my dear young lady. You'll take a seat for a minute or two and compose yourself, and I'll get you an ice or a little wine. He kept patting my hand, which was on his arm, and looking at me very anxiously. Bless me, bless me. I never thought it would have this effect, he said. But I would not allow him to take me away in that direction. I went to the picture again and looked at it without seeing it. And then I went across the room again with some kind of wild thought that if I insisted I should find it. My window, he said. There was one of the professors standing there, and he heard me. Ah, the window, he. Ah, you've been taking in with what appears outside. It was put there to be in uniformity with the window on the stair. It never was a real window. It's just behind that bookcase. Many people are taken in by it, he said. His voice seemed to sound from somewhere far away, as if it would go on forever. The hall swam in a dazzle of shining and of noises around me, and the daylight through the open window grew greyer, waiting till it should be over, and the bubble burst. Chapter 5. It was Mr. Pitnelly who took me home, or rather it was I who took him, pushing him on a little in front of me, holding fast by his arm, not waiting for Aunt Mary or for anyone. We came out into the daylight again outside, I without even a cloak or a shawl, with my bare arms and uncovered head and the pearls round my neck. There was a rush of people about, and that baker's boy stood right in my way and cried, "Ah, here's a Bran." shouting to the others. The words struck me somehow, as his tone had struck the window, without any reason. But I did not mind the people staring, and hurried across the street with Mr. Pitmilly half a step in advance. The door was open, and Janet standing at it, looking out to see what she could see of the ladies in their grand dresses. She gave a shriek when she saw me hurrying across the street, but I brushed past her, pushed Mr. Pitmilly up the stairs, and took him breathless to the recess, where I threw myself down on the seat, feeling as if I could not have gone another step farther, and waved my hand across to the window. There, there, I cried. Ah, there it was. Not that senseless mob, not the theatre and the gas and the people all in a murmur and clang of talking. Never in all these days had I seen that room so clearly. There was a faint tone of light behind, as if it might have been a reflection from some of those vulgar lights in the hall, and he sat against it, calm, wrapped in his thoughts, with his face turned to the window. Nobody but must have seen him. And Janet could have seen him had I called her upstairs. It was like a picture, all the things I knew, and the same attitude in the atmosphere, full of quietness, not disturbed by anything. I pulled Mr. Pitmilly's arm before I let him go. You see, I cried. He gave me the most bewildered look, as if he would have liked to cry. He saw nothing. I was sure of that from his eyes. He was an old man. There was no vision in him. If I had called up Janet, she would have seen it all. My dear, he said. My dear, waving his hands in a helpless way. He's been there all these nights, I cried. And I thought you could tell me who he was and what he was doing, and that he might have taken me into the room and showed me that I might tell Papa. Papa would understand. He would like to hear. Oh, can't you tell me what work he's doing, Mr. Pitmilly? He never lifts his head so long as the light throws a shadow. And then, when it is like this, he turns round and thinks and takes a rest. Mr. Pitmilly was trembling, whether it was with cold or I know not what. He said with a shake in his voice, oh, my dear young lady, my dear, and then stopped and looked at me as if he were going to cry. It's pitiful, he said, and then another voice. I'm going across there again to bring your Aunt Mary home. Do you understand, my poor little thing? I'm going to bring her home, and you will be better when she is here. I was glad he went away, as he could not see anything, and I sat alone in the dark, which was not dark, but quite clear light, a light like nothing I ever saw. How clear it was in that room, not glaring like the gas and the voices, but so quiet, everything so visible, as if it were in another world. I heard a little rustle behind me, and there was Janet, standing staring at me with two big eyes wide open. She was only a little older than I was. I called to her, Janet, come here, and you will see him. Come here and see him. Impatient that she should be so shy and keep behind. Oh, my bunny young lady, she said, and burst out crying. I stamped my foot at her in my indignation that she would not come, and she fled before me with a rustle and swing of haste as if she were afraid. None of them, not even a girl like myself with the sight in her eyes would understand. I turned back again and held up my hands to him sitting there, who was the only one that knew. Oh, say something to me. I don't know who you are or what you are, but you're lonely. So am I. And I only feel for you. Say something to me. I neither hoped that he would hear nor expected any answer. How could he hear, with the street between us and his window shut, and all the murmurings of the voices and the people standing about? But for one moment, it seemed to me that there was only him and me in the whole world. But I gasped with my breath that had almost gone from me when I saw him move in his chair. He had heard me, though I knew not how. He rose up, and I rose too, speechless, incapable of anything but this mechanical movement. He seemed to draw me as if I were a puppet moved by his will. He came forward to the window, stood looking across at me. I was sure that he looked at me. At last he had seen me. At last he had found out that somebody, though only a girl, was watching him, looking for him, believing in him. I was in such trouble and commotion of mind and trembling that I could not keep on my feet, but dropped kneeling on the window seat, supporting myself against the window, feeling as if my heart were being drawn out of me. I cannot describe his face. It was all dim, yet there was a light on it. I think it must have been a smile. And as closely as I looked at him, he looked at me. His hair was fair. There was a little quiver about his lips. Then he put his hands upon the window to open it. It was stiff and hard to move, but at last he forced it open with a sound that echoed all along the street. I saw that people heard it, and several looked up. As for me, I put my hands together, leaning with my face against the glass, drawn to him as if he could have gone out of myself, my heart out of my bosom, my eyes out of my head. He opened the window with a noise that was heard from the west port to the Abbey. Could anyone doubt that? And then he leaned forward, out of the window, looking out. There was not one in the street but must have seen him. He looked at me first with a little wave of his hand as if it were a salutation, yet not exactly that either, for I thought he waved me away. And then he looked up and down in the dim shining of the ending day, first to the east, to the old Abbey towers, and then to the west, on the broad line of the street where so many people were coming and going, but so little noise, all like enchanted folk in an enchanted place. I watched him with such a melting heart, with such a deep satisfaction as words could not say, for nobody could tell me now that he was not there. Nobody could say I was dreaming any more. I watched him as if I could not breathe, my heart in my throat, my eyes upon him. He looked up and down, then he looked back to me. I was the first, and I was the last, though it was not for long. He did know, he did see who it was that had recognised him and sympathised with him all the time. I was in a kind of rapture, yet stupor too. My look went with his look, following it as if I were his shadow. And then, suddenly, he was gone, and I saw him no more. I dropped back again upon my seat, seeking something to support me, something to lean upon. He had lifted his head and waved it once again to me, waved it once again to me. How he went I cannot tell, nor where he went I cannot tell, but in a moment he was away, and the window standing open, and the room fading into stillness and dimness, yet so clear, with all its space and the great picture in its gilded frame upon the wall. It gave me no pain to see him go away. My heart was content. I was so worn out and satisfied. What doubt or question could there be about him now? As I was lying back as weak as water, Aunt Mary came in behind me and flew to me with a little rustle as if she had come on wings, put her arms around me and drew my head onto her breast. I had begun to cry a little, with sobs like a child. You saw him, I said. To lean upon her and feel her so soft, so kind, gave me a pleasure I cannot describe, and her arms around me and her voice saying, "Honey, honey," as if she were nearly crying out. Lying there, I came back to myself quite sweetly, glad of everything, but I wanted some assurance from them that they had seen him too. I waved my hand to the window that was still standing open, and the room that was stealing away into the faint dark. "This time you saw it all," I said, getting more eager. "My honey," said Aunt Mary, giving me a kiss. Mr. Picknelly began to walk about the room with short little steps behind, as if he were out of patience. I sat straight up and put away Aunt Mary's arms. "You cannot be so blind, I cried. "Well, not tonight, at least not tonight." But neither the one nor the other made any reply. I shook myself quite free and raised myself, and there, in the middle of the street, stood the baker's boy, like a statue, staring up at the open window with his mouth open and his face full of wonder, breathless, as if he could not believe what he saw. I darted forward, calling to him and beckoned him to come to me. "Oh, bring him up, bring him to me," I cried. Mr. Picknelly went out directly and got the boy by the shoulder. He did not want to come. It was strange to see the little old gentleman with his beautiful frill and his diamond pin standing out in the street with his hand upon the boy's shoulder, and the other boys round, all in a little crowd. And presently they came towards the house, the others all following, gaping and wondering. He came in unwilling, almost resisting, looking as if we meant him some harm. "Come away, my laddie, and come and speak to the young lady," Mr. Picknelly was saying. And Aunt Mary took my hands to keep me back, but I would not be kept back. "Boy," I cried, "you saw it too? You saw it? Tell them you saw it. It is that I want, and no more." He looked at me as they all did, as if he thought I was mad. "What's she wanting with me?" he said. And then, "I did nae harm, even if I did throw a stane at it, and it's nae sin to throw a stane." "You rascal," Mr. Picknelly, giving my shape. "Have you been throwing stones? You'll kill somebody some of these days with your stones." The old gentleman was confused and troubled, for he did not understand what I wanted, nor anything that had happened. And then Aunt Mary, holding my hands and drawing me close to her, spake. Laddie, she said, answer the young lady, like a good lad. There's no intention of finding fault with you. Answer her, my man, and then Janet will give you your supper before you go. Oh, speak, speak, I cried. Answer them and tell them. You saw that window opened and the gentleman look out and wave his hands. I saw nae gentleman, he said with his head down, except that wee gentleman there. Listen, laddie, said Aunt Mary. I saw you standing in the middle of the street staring. What were you looking at? It was nothing to make a work about. It was just yon windy yonder in the library that's nae windy, and it was open, as sure as death. You may laugh if you like. It's that she's wanting with me. You're telling a pack of lies, laddie, Mr. Pimley said. I'm telling nae lies. You're standing open just like any other windy. It's as sure as death. I couldn't believe it myself, but it's true. And there it is, I cried, turning round and pointing it out to them with great triumph in my heart. But the light was all grey. It had faded. It had changed. The window was just as it had always been, a sombre break upon the wall. I was treated like an invalid all that evening and taken upstairs to bed, and Aunt Mary sat up in my room the whole night through. Whenever I opened my eyes, she was always sitting there close to me, watching. And there never was in all my life so strange a night. When I would talk in my excitement, she kissed me and hushed me like a child. Oh, honey, you're not the only one, she said. I wished, Ben. I should never have let you be there. Aunt Mary, you have seen him too. Oh, wished, honey, Aunt Mary said. Her eyes were shining. There were tears in them. Wished, put it out of your mind. Try to sleep. I will not speak another word, she cried. But I had my arms around her and my mouth at her ear. Who is he there? Tell me that and I will ask no more. Oh, honey, rest and try to sleep. It's just, how can I tell you? A dream. Did you not hear what Lady Carnby said? The women of our blood. What? Aunt Mary? I cannot tell you, she cried in her agitation. I cannot tell you. How can I tell you when I know just what you knew and no more? To longing all your life after, to looking for what never comes. He will come, I cried. I shall see him tomorrow, that I know. She kissed me and cried over me, her cheek hot and wet like mine. My honey, try if you can sleep. And we'll wait to see what happens, what tomorrow brings. I have no fear, said I. And then I suppose, though it is strange to think of, I must have fallen asleep. I was so worn out and young and not used to lying in my bed awake. From time to time I opened my eyes and sometimes jumped up, remembering everything. But Aunt Mary was always there to soothe me, and I lay down again in her shelter, like a bird in its nest. But I would not let them keep me in bed next day. I was in a kind of fever, not knowing what I did. The window was quite opaque, without the least glimmer in it, flat and blank like a piece of wood. Never from the first day had I seen it so little like a window. It cannot be wondered at, I said to myself, that seeing it like that and with eyes that are old, not so clear as mine, they should think what they do. And then I smiled to myself to think of the evening and the long light, and whether he would look out again or only give me a signal with his hand. I decided I would like that best. Not that he should take the trouble to come forward and open it again, but just a turn of his head and a wave of his hand. It would be more friendly and show more confidence, not as if I wanted that kind of demonstration every night. I did not come down in the afternoon, but kept at my own window upstairs alone till the tea party should be over. I could hear them making a great talk, and I was sure they were all in the recess staring at the window and laughing at the silly lassie. Let them laugh. I felt above all that now. At dinner, I was very restless, hurrying to get it over. And I think Aunt Mary was restless too. I doubt whether she read her Times when it came. She opened it up so as to shield her and watched from a corner, and I settled myself in the recess with my heart full of expectation. I wanted nothing more than to see him writing at his table, to turn his head and give me a little wave of his hand, just to show that he knew I was there. I sat from 7:30 to 10:00, and the daylight grew softer and softer, till at last it was as if it was shining through a pearl and not a shadow to be seen. The window, all the time, was as black as night, and there was nothing there. Well, but other nights it had been like that. He would not be there every night, only to please me. There are other things in a man's life, a great learned man like that. I said to myself I was not disappointed. Why should I be disappointed? There had been other nights when he was not there. Aunt Mary watched me, every movement I made, her eyes shining, often wet, with a pity in them that almost made me cry. But I felt as if I were more sorry for her than for myself. And then I flung myself upon her and asked her again and again what it was and who it was, imploring her to tell me if she knew, and when she had seen him and what had happened and what it meant about the women of our blood. She told me that how it was she could not tell, nor when. It was just at the time it had to be, and that we all saw him in our time. That is, she said, the ones that are like you and me. What was it that made her and me different from the rest? But she only shook her head and would not tell me. They say, said she, and then stopped short. Oh, honey, try and forget all about it. If I had but known you were of that kind. They say that once there was one that was a scholar, liked his books more than any lady's love. Honey, do not look at me like that. Do you think I should have brought all this on you? He was a scholar, I cried. And one of us, that must have been a light woman, not like you and me, but maybe it was just an innocence. For who can tell? She waved to him to come over. A young ring was the token, but he would not come. But still she sat at her window and waved, till at last her brothers heard of it. There was stirring then, and then... But my honey, let us speak of it no more. They killed him, I cried, carried away. And then I grasped her with my hands and gave her a shake and flung about from her. You tell me that to throw dust in my eyes when I saw him only last night, and he is living as I am, and as young. My honey, Aunt Mary said. After that I would not speak to her for a long time, but she kept close to me, never leaving me when she could help it, and always with that pity in her eyes. For the next night it was the same, and the third night. That third night I thought I could not bear it any longer. I would have to do something, if only I knew what to do. If it would ever get dark, quite dark, there might be something to be done. I had wild dreams of stealing out of the house and getting a ladder and mounting up to try if I could not open that window in the middle of the night. Perhaps I could get the baker's boy to help me, and then my mind got in a whirl. It was as if I had done it, and I could almost see the boy put the ladder to the window and hear him cry out that there was nothing there. Oh, how slow it was, the night, and how light it was, and everything so clear. No darkness to cover you, no shadow, whether on one side of the street or on the other. I could not sleep, though I was forced to go to bed. And in the deep midnight, when it is dark, dark in every other place, I slipped very softly downstairs, though there was one board on the landing place that creaked, and opened the door and stepped out. There was not a soul to be seen up or down from the Abbey to the Westport, and the trees stood like ghosts, and the silence was terrible, and everything was clear as day. You don't know what silence is till you find it in a light like that. Not morning but night, no surprising, no shadow, but everything as clear as day. It did not make any difference as the slow minutes went on. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. How strange it was to hear the clocks striking in that dead light when there was nobody to hear them. But it made no difference. The window was quite blank. Even the marking of the panes seemed to have melted away. I stole up again after a long time, though the silent house, and the clear light cold and trembling, with despair in my heart. I am sure Aunt Mary must have watched, seen me coming back, for after a while I heard faint sounds in the house, and very early, when there had come a little sunshine into the air, she came to my bedside with a cup of tea in her hand, and she too was looking like a ghost. Are you warm, honey? Are you comfortable? She said. It doesn't matter, said I. I did not feel as if anything mattered, unless if one could get into the dark somewhere, the soft, deep dark that would cover you over and hide you. But I could not tell from what. The dreadful thing was that there was nothing to look for, nothing to hide from, only the silence and the light. That day, my mother came and took me home. I had not heard she was coming. She arrived quite unexpectedly and said she had no time to stay. We must start the same evening, as to be in London next day, Papa having settled to go abroad. At first I had a wild thought I would not go. But how can a girl say I will not, when her mother has come for her, and there is no reason in the world to resist, and no right? I had to go, whatever I might wish, or anyone might say. Aunt Mary's dear eyes were wet. She went about the house, drying them quietly with her handkerchief, but she always said, "It's the best thing for you, honey, the best thing for you." Oh, how I hated to hear it said that it was the best thing, as if anything mattered one more than another. The old ladies were all there in the afternoon, Lady Carnby looking at me from under her black lace, and the diamond lurking, sending out darts from under her finger. She patted me on the shoulder and told me to be a good bairn. "Never listen to what you see from the window," she said. "The eyes is deceitful as well as the heart." She kept patting me on the shoulder, and I felt again as if that sharp, wicked stone stung me. Was that what Aunt Mary meant when she said yon ring was the token? I thought afterwards I saw the mark on my shoulder. Will say why? How can I tell why? If I had known, I should have been contented, and it would not have mattered any more. I never went back to St. Rule's. For years of my life, I never again looked out of a window when any other window was in sight. You ask me, did I ever see him again? I cannot tell. The imagination is a great deceiver, as Lady Carnby said, and if he stayed there so long only to punish the race that had wronged him, why should I ever have seen him again? For I had received my share. But who can tell what happens in a heart that often, and so long as that comes back to do his errand? If it was he whom I have seen again, the anger is gone from him, and he means good, and no longer harm to the house of the woman that loved him. I have seen his face looking at me from a crowd. There was one time when I came home a widow from India, very sad with my little children. I am certain I saw him there among all the people coming to welcome their friends. There was nobody to welcome me, for I was not expected, and very sad was I without a face I knew. And all at once I saw him, and he waved his hand to me. My heart leapt up again. I had forgotten who he was, but only that it was a face I knew, and I landed almost cheerfully, thinking here was someone who would help me. But he had disappeared, as he did from the window with that one wave of his hand. And again I was reminded of it, all when old Lady Carnby died, an old, old woman, and it was found in her will that she had left me that diamond ring. I'm afraid of it still. It's locked up in an old sandalwood box in the lumber room, a little old country house which belongs to me, but where I never live. If anyone would steal it, it would be a relief to my mind. Yet I never knew what Aunt Mary meant when she said yon ring was the token, nor what it could have to do with that strange window in the old college library of St. Rule's. That's the end. I apologise for my reading of Scott's